All right, moving into section 3, we have network items, encryption, and PKI, public key infrastructure. Starting out with some tools, definitely want to talk about scanning. We touched upon different scans you can have. We looked at them in the previous mod for how they look over Wireshark and packet capture, but Nmap is a tool you should be familiar with by name. It's short for Network Mapper. It's a free and open source tool used for network exploration, management, and auditing. So you're pretty much scanning your network and you're doing so with Nmap. Nmap can have a bunch of different scans that it's going to perform based on getting different flags back from hosts that are up or closed, like we talked about in Mod 7. Just a couple of different scan options: TCP Connect, UDP, a SYN stealth scan, a FIN scan, Xmas scan, putting up your FIN, urge, and push flags to that target port and awaiting a response. The most important thing to take away is when you're scanning an organization, you're figuring out what's up for devices on your network through one of these methodology scans or a combination of these scans, and you're exploring your network to then map it. We want to map out what devices are where in what subnet of our network and figure out what our topology looks like. We need to do this through scanning. Another terminology to be aware of is OS fingerprinting. This is the process of identifying the operating system running on a network device by analyzing its network communication patterns, and you can gain information about vulnerabilities. You should also be aware of the term banner grabbing, which we'll discuss a little bit later on with Netcat. But basically, based on the results that can come back from scanning, or you can do banner grabbing or OS fingerprinting, you can actually identify the specific operating system of that host just by scanning it for that information. Speaking of banner grabbing, we have Netcat, but the buzzword that I want you to remember for Netcat is a remote listener. It's a tool that will allow you to share communications from one device to another. The other device is usually the attacker's machine that they're monitoring for traffic and communication. You can read and write data across this network connection. You can do TCP or UDP connections. You can have a Netcat listener set up. You can transfer files between these hosts, port scanning, port forwarding. It's a cybersecurity tool, sure, but really, if we see Netcat on the network, I would definitely be alarmed and would want to clarify if that's legitimate use by someone doing testing or a red team operation that's going on. If not, you probably have an active threat actor within your network. Testing connectivity, transferring data in and out, setting up a listener port to then move data between hosts. And you can also conduct banner grabbing with it. This is a screenshot of what banner grabbing would look like using Netcat. So it's the NC is the command to invoke the Netcat utility to that host of interest on port 80. Gives us the information returned back that it's an Apache 2.4.25 Debian server. So it's an Apache based web server, and on port 80 here, and it gives you additional information related to banner grabbing. Just wanted to see an example of what it would look like as an output, and it can give you some insight potentially as well for if you scan it further, what ports are open or some vulnerabilities that might be present on that system. Talking about firewalls, there's a couple of different states that you can have. You can have stateful or stateless. Stateful just means that it's going to dynamically update its rules based on the state of network connections, and it's more secure than a stateless firewall. It has better protection, and a stateless firewall is just going to filter network traffic based on static rules. It's not going to be dynamic like a stateful firewall. So dynamic versus static down here, secure versus less secure for a stateless firewall. It's not actually going to be managing the state of connections or conversations as they're going over the firewall, whereas a stateful is going to say, oh yes, I did see that packet go out to establish a communication with server A. I would expect a SYNAC or a return of data or wherever they're at in the state of the conversation to be returned back to whatever client was requesting that resource. So it's keeping track of the state of the conversations and the network connections happening, whereas stateless is just like, I don't know what's going on. We can transfer data, sure. So that's why it's less secure. And the last terminology to definitely be aware of is a DMZ. This is a demilitarized zone. I want you to think buffer zone as kind of the buzzword here. This is our DMZ network down here. So if this is our company, we have all of our critical data servers down here, critical file servers, whatever else are critical data that we don't want to be publicly accessible to the internet where, threat actors can live and bad actors can live. The DMZ is going to host your public-facing services that you need to be accessible to your clients or other people trying to access your resources for your company. I mean, you can't have everything locked behind your firewall because, as we talked about before, you might host an online web store, or you need a mail server to be publicly accessible to your clients or other people wanting to use your product or interact with everything that you face out in the internet serving world of people who want to do business with you. So in order to provide another layer of protection for your organization, instead of opening up your web server here to the internet, you can create a demilitarized zone that has a buffer of additional layers of firewall between traffic that's coming into your network, and at least if something hits the fan here and this gets popped and exploited, it's not going to make it back. Well, I mean, it can, but hopefully there's a less risk that if this web server becomes popped, they're also going to be able to affect your critical data and file servers that you don't have publicly accessible to the internet by creating a buffer zone and a DMZ to have additional layers of firewalls in place. So it's just serving as an additional layer of security, and it's going to isolate these public-facing services from your internal network to the public-facing internet and still be able to provide those services to the public-facing internet for those that need it. I definitely would be familiar, as we've talked about, the difference between an IDS and an IPS. An IDS, remember, this stands for Intrusion Detection System. An IPS is Intrusion Prevention System. Prevention is actually going to take an action. Detection is just going to be like, yep, we saw it, there it goes. It's going to just detect and collect and store logs. Now, usually an IPS will do everything that an IDS can do, but also take an action. But the main point of this slide, I really want you to be aware of, we know IDS is detection and P can actually prevent and take an action like drop or reject a packet. But if you think about this diagram here and where an IPS is placed versus where an IDS is placed, it will just solidify the concepts for you that much more. An IPS is always going to sit in line with your network traffic. So if we have the malicious threat actor over here on the internet, they go to our public-facing router, that's our gateway. Coming inbound, we have our firewall set up. If they get past our firewall, we have our intrusion prevention system in line before they come into, I guess all of this is our network here, but into our critical resources, our IPS is still another layer, defense in depth here. If all these fail for firewall, that can actually drop a packet. If this is not sitting in line to your packet and it's sitting out of line or offline, like an intrusion detection system will, there is no chance that it can prevent an action on a packet because it's not in line with where the packets are traversing. So an IDS is not going to sit in line, and it's going to, maybe this is a span port, it's going to collect and log. There is no preventative action it can take because it's not sitting in line where packets are traversing. So the malicious packet is just going to come in. If your firewall fails, that's it. The packet's still going in, but your IDS will have picked up on that packet. Maybe it's set a log or a message to be like, oh, that packet was detected, you should review it. But it's just maybe coming off of a spanning port, which is just a port mirror for one traffic coming in on the switch to then mirror out and give an exact copy to your IDS for then you to review or comb through the logs through. But with the IDS not sitting in line, it cannot take any action. So hopefully these diagrams here, now that you see it in inline versus sitting offline or off a span port of a switch, why one can actually prevent a packet and one is actually not going to be able to take an action on a packet. Some of the leading companies out there for intrusion prevention systems, like the networking mod, Cisco, Palo Alto, Fortinet, Juniper, they're all going to be leading security solutions for you. And IDS, we move into the category of open source. So anyone can go learn Snort. You can go get Suricata, you can use Bro or Zlogs, OSSec, and Security Onion, which is a suite of tools that you can leverage as well. An IDS, put it up in your home environment, observe, collect, make rules for, etc. Okay, hashing and algorithms, we've talked about a little bit briefly, but we want to keep in mind hashing is not encryption. Do not confuse the two. We're going to cover encryption in the next slide, but hashing, we're thinking the CIA triad, we're thinking about integrity. My data is what I said the data was, and I prove that through a hash value. The hash is basically taking a text input from a document for how all of the bytes are arranged in the exact order that they're in. It's going to perform a mathematical algorithm on it, which is your hash function, to say if all of these bits are in the same exact order, this would be the hash value associated to it to say these bits have not been changed. They are in the same exact order that they were before. And you get a hash value output to represent the kind of integrity of that text file to say none of the bits have changed within that document. Here's the hash to prove it. So the output is always going to be a unique digital fingerprint of the inputted data. So this text file, if it is unique, it will always have the same hash. Common security tools, if it is the legitimate tool, will always have the same known good hash value. Used for data integrity checks, password storage, digital signatures. Some of the different hash mathematical algorithms you can have, MD5. We're not going to get into the specifics of how cryptographic hash functions work, but it produces a 128-bit hash value. MD5 and SHA-1 are considered insecure and vulnerable to cracking because they're subject to collision attacks. And SHA-1 is secure hash algorithm, so you pretty much have your MD5s and your SHAs. You can have SHA-1, 2. I would be familiar with SHA-256, giving you a 256-bit hash value. Came from the NSA. It's designed to be more secure than the message digest hash algorithm, and again, used for the same reasons to provide data integrity checks. There's also checksums, which is a simple data integrity check. It's getting into the concept of a checksum value that you can have. We saw that a little bit in header analysis, and a good example to take away from what a checksum is, it's an outputted mathematical result. If this were my checksum value, it would be checked again in a kind of cyclic redundancy check by the computer to be like, is that still the same checksum that I had before? If so, we're good to move forward. If not, it's a different checksum. It's another way to check your data and perform integrity checking on it is a checksum. And when we think about hashes from the blue team side of operations, we're always thinking about the free and open source tool to use of VirusTotal. Take your hash, throw it in there, see if any other leading security vendors are flagging it as potentially malicious. It'll give you some output. It'll give you all the different hashes associated to that file. And it's generally a pretty good starting point to say if that file is malicious or not based on the integrity of it, and you're looking at and conducting hash analysis. All right, Encryption. There's two main types of encryption that I want you to be aware of. We have symmetric and asymmetric. S for symmetric means same key. Now you should never get that question wrong on an exam because it will always ask you which form of encryption uses two keys. Well, two keys means they weren't the same key, and asymmetric will use one for public and one for private. So symmetric, if you just remember S stands for same key, there's only one key involved with symmetric encryption. So let's take a look and break it down. It's going to use a single secret key to both encrypt and decrypt the data. It's extremely fast and efficient for this reason because there's only one key involved. It is the same exact key used to encrypt it, and then to decrypt the data, it's going to use the same key. So that is why it's very fast and efficient. Both the sender and recipient must have access to the same secret key to encrypt or decrypt the data. And some examples I want you to be aware of are AES, DES, and 3DES, triple DES for encryption standards that are used as advanced encryption standard for encrypting data via symmetric encryption. AES, I want you to think data at rest. AES is the leading encryption suite that we have for encrypting data at rest. So hard drives, things of those natures, if we're going to encrypt it and have a hard drive encrypted, we're going to be probably using AES. The other type of encryption that you have is asymmetric, so two keys. You're going to have a public key and a private key. The public key is going to be used to encrypt the data, and your private key is always going to be used to decrypt the data, and together they create an asymmetric key pair. So because there are two keys and there's a bit of exchange and more math and exchanging that happens for making sure the keys are encrypted and sent securely, it is now slower. But it's more secure because more keys, more security, less chance that both keys are compromised as opposed to one key. The thing to note about your public key, that can go to anybody. It's free to the public. It doesn't hurt anyone if your public key gets out there to the world to know. But your private key, you want to do as the name implies and keep that private. You do not want to share your private key with anyone else. If you do and someone else gets your private key, well, they can act as you. They can sign things through digital signatures and send data off using your private key and act like it came from you. So we definitely want to keep our private key private and our public key open to whoever needs it to verify the exchange of data that's happening. Examples include RSA and the Diffie-Hellman, that is a typo there, Diffie, i.e. Diffie-Hellman key exchange process. Both of those use asymmetric encryption. And an example where this is used, security and confidentiality are important, such as financial transactions, banking, online banking, or secure communications, digital signatures for emails, etc. So main takeaways for this one: symmetric, same key, one key to do the encryption and decryption with; asymmetric, two keys, public and private. Never share out your private key. Talking about keys, we got to cover PKI, public key infrastructure. You could just be the person at your org that does nothing but PKI all day, manages digital certificates, manages public keys, manages the setup of it, standard of encryption that you're using, digital signatures, email communications, etc. You could just be someone who provisions and deprovisions keys all day long for new users coming to your organization and, doing updates to your PKI infrastructure. It is a whole job dedicated to potentially a team of one or two people within your organization, depending on size. So, public key infrastructure, used to manage all of your digital certificates, public keys, which are used for authentication, encryption, digital signatures, and online communications. The examples that I want you to think of for what's using PKI: email, which digital signatures, banking transactions, HTTPS for secure web browsing, all are leveraging PKI. As we talked earlier, for asymmetric encryption, PKI has a public key and a private key. Public key, we're good to share out. Private key, we keep private, and if it was shared out, that would be a bad day. So it's amazing how, as I've gone to school and starting my career, 8 years ago, still looking up PKI, we still get the example of Alice and Bob. I think that's hilarious, so I'm going to continue the trend and just continue teaching PKI through using Alice and Bob wanting to send an email to each other, and they're going to digitally sign it. So if we have Alice over here who wants to send an email to Bob, let's see how the keys play out. So we will have private key. I don't even know how to draw a key, so we'll just say that is the key. Alice is going to encrypt her email message, the plain text that's within the message that she's typing out. She's going to encrypt the message with her private key. Now, this creates ciphertext output that is an encrypted email message that Alice has encrypted with her private key. But Alice has two keys because we're talking about PKI, two keys. So Alice also has a public. Let's do a different color. Alice also has a public key. Now, remember, anybody, like Bob, can go and view Alice's public key. Bob also has a public key. Bob also has a private key. So what happens for the exchange of information here is if this email has been digitally signed through Alice's private key and it's encrypted the message, and now we have this ciphertext, this ciphertext is still going to come inbound to Bob as encrypted ciphertext. How is Bob going to decrypt this ciphertext? Well, he's going to use the only thing available to him and use Alice's public key to decrypt the value that Alice encrypted with her private key. Bob's public key is no good on something that was encrypted with somebody else's private key. Bob needs to go view and grab Alice's public key to then decrypt the message encrypted with Alice's private key in order to be able to read it. So once that happens, the message will be a decrypted email message, and it's going to come back up as plain text email message for Bob to be able to read. Now, the important thing to realize through this exchange for how this happens is a term called non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that the sender is who the sender says they are because of how this mathematical algorithm works out with public key infrastructure. Because Bob had to decrypt the message with Alice's public key, it could only have come from someone who had encrypted the data with Alice's private key. And hopefully that's Alice, because Alice knows better than to share out her private key, right? So for the simplicity of this example, it must have come from Alice. Non-repudiation is in effect to be like this is definitely a message from Alice. And there is no doubt that is non-repudiation, a form of saying the message is coming from whoever they sent it from. Now, Bob's thinking this, non-repudiation, that means the message only could have come from Alice. Now, let's say there was another person that Alice sent an email to as well. We'll just say that person's name is Eve. If Alice also sent the same message to Eve, Eve is also going to go out and grab Alice's public key and decrypt the message so that it becomes plain text for her to read, and Eve will also say, yes, this message came from only Alice because I used Alice's public key to decrypt it, and it means it only could have been encrypted with Alice's private key. So Eve could have used Alice's public key to decrypt this message, but Eve cannot modify the message contents and then resend it to Bob to say, hey, this message came from Eve. That would not happen, because if she's going to modify this contents, it would have to have happened after the decryption happened with Alice's public key. That is how non-repudiation really comes into play here, because the message is from who we said it was from, and we said it was from Alice with her public key being used. So even if somebody is off to the side, like Eve, trying to fake a message to Bob saying it's from Eve, if Bob were to go out and grab Eve's public key, that would not decrypt this original ciphertext message that was encrypted with Alice's private key. So it could only have come from Alice. Extremely confusing. I don't know if my diagram was the cleanest or the neatest, but definitely go out and check out other resources for digital signatures, PKI, exchange, and non-repudiation, and hopefully the concept will be solidified. I give myself a solid 7 out of 10 there for explaining PKI and non-repudiation. I did my best. Now, digital certificates, since we're talking about them, digital signatures, let's talk about digital certificates. This is an electronic document that verifies the identity of the individual, organization, or device in an online communication. It's going to contain information such as the name of the certificate holder, the public key of the certificate holder, and name of the certificate authority, the CA, that issued the certificate. If you ever go into your Windows settings and you're looking up what root certificates or certificates are present on your box, it has that little box there for general information, details, and other certificate paths that you could be using to map to another CA or something like that. I'm sure you've seen this box before. So the certificate authority, this I want you to think of as someone who could act as a notary. If you go out and you give your passport and your driver's license and all your documentation, you show up with your photo IDs to a third party notary service like the post office or a person working for a notary, they verify that you are who you are. So it's verifying your identity, and it's going to hold your certificate with the certificate authority that acts like the notary. So once you've kind of registered your certificate with the certificate authority, it will say it's approved, we've verified the identity. It's going to maintain a publicly available directory of all those issued certificates. It will issue out digital certificates and root certificates, and it's also going to keep track of what certificates have expired or been revoked. So if you're using a certificate and you go to the certificate authority to be like, hey, is this legitimate or not? Do you accept my certificate? It will either say, yep, it's good, it hasn't been revoked, it's not expired, it looks clean to me, I trust it, and it will move on. If it hasn't, or if it's been revoked or expired, it will be like, nope, I don't trust it, I'm not going to accept your certificate, and you may not be able to do whatever function you're trying to do, like web browsing or use an application, etc. A root certificate is a digital certificate that serves as the foundation of a CA's trust infrastructure. So this is a root certificate found in here, issued by the certificate authority itself. It's used to validate all other certificates used by that CA. So it's somewhat hierarchical, but I'm not going to say that digital certificates are hierarchical in nature. You can have different types of certificates as well. Server certificates, identity of a web server or an online communication. You can have a personal certificate used to identify an individual in an online communication, like email and digital signatures used for authentication. Or you can have a code signing certificate, which software pushes, and the software vendor wants to digitally sign their software. They'll give it a certificate to be like, yep, this is the authenticity and integrity of our software vetted by the vendor, and we trust it, and it's good to go. So it's protecting the publisher's identity for whoever made the software from someone going out and pirating or making malware out of the same software that you thought you were buying legitimately. So it prevents tampering or modification of that code.